The story of Joan of Arc begins not with her birth, but with understanding the fractured world into which she arrived. By 1412, when a peasant girl was born in the village of Domrémy, France had been locked in conflict with England for 75 years. The 100 Years' War, as it would later be known, had begun in 1327, when King Edward III of England pressed his claim to the French throne. This was no mere territorial squabble between neighbouring kingdoms. The conflict represented a fundamental question about the future of medieval Europe. Who would rule the wealthiest, most populous kingdom in Western Christendom? The war had ebbed and flowed across decades, but by the early 15th century, England appeared to have achieved decisive supremacy. King Henry V of England had invaded France in 1415, leading his army to a stunning victory at Agincourt on October 25th of that year. Against overwhelming odds, English longbowmen and men-at-arms had shattered a much larger French force. The flower of French nobility lay dead on the muddy battlefield. Thousands of French knights and nobles perished that day, while the English suffered minimal casualties. The psychological impact of Agincourt resonated across France for years. English soldiers seemed invincible. Following Agincourt, the English conquest accelerated. Henry V proved not merely a brilliant battlefield commander, but an astute politician and strategist. By 1420, he had forced the signing of the Treaty of Troyes, perhaps the most humiliating document in French history to that date. The treaty declared that Henry V and his heirs would inherit the French throne, completely bypassing the French royal line. Charles VI of France, who suffered from recurring bouts of mental illness, agreed to disinherit his own son. The Dauphin Charles, the rightful heir, was cast aside, branded by some as illegitimate. The treaty had been signed under duress, with much of northern France occupied by English forces. But what made the situation even more desperate for France was that the nation fought against itself as much as against the English invaders. French politics had descended into vicious civil war between two great factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. These were not minor disagreements, but a blood feud that tore the kingdom apart. The Armagnac faction supported the Dauphin Charles and represented loyalty to the House of Valois, the ruling French royal family. Their name came from Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac, one of their early leaders. They controlled territories mainly in southern France with their base at Bourges. The Burgundian faction, led by the powerful Duke of Burgundy, had allied themselves with the English. This was not mere political expedience. In 1407, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, had ordered the assassination of Louis, Duke of Orleans, who was the brother of King Charles VI. This murder created a vendetta that would shape Domrémy's history for decades. When Joan of Arc was born, John the Fearless had been dead for 7 years, himself assassinated in 1419 during a supposed peace meeting. The murder occurred on a bridge at Montereau, and whether the Dauphin Charles had ordered it or merely failed to prevent it remained a source of debate. What was certain was that John's son, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, swore vengeance. Philip allied completely with England, providing troops, resources, and legitimacy to the English claim. His territories included wealthy Flanders, giving him enormous economic power. The Burgundians controlled Paris and much of northern France. They held Reims, the traditional coronation site for French kings. The situation when Joan was born could hardly have been more dire for France. The country was divided, its nobility decimated at Agincourt, its king mad, its heir disinherited and mocked as the King of Bourges because his authority extended barely beyond that city. English armies occupied Normandy, Paris, and much of the north. Their Burgundian allies controlled vast territories. The common people suffered under the constant warfare. Soldiers from all seas ravaged the countryside, stealing livestock, burning villages, disrupting trade and agriculture. This was the world of Joan of Arc's childhood. The 100 Years' War was not some distant conflict, but an immediate pressing reality that touched every French village, including the remote hamlet of Domrémy where she lived. The village itself straddled a peculiar political situation. While technically in the Duchy of Bar, which had ambiguous feudal status, the people of Domrémy considered themselves loyal to the French king, to the Armagnac cause. They were surrounded by Burgundian territory, making them a small island of loyalty in a hostile region. The villagers had experienced warfare directly. In 1419, armed bands had attacked the area. In 1425, when Joan was about 13 years old, raiders struck Domrémy itself. The villagers' cattle were stolen, houses were burned. The people fled to a nearby fortified refuge called the Castle of the Island. These were not abstract historical events, but traumatic experiences that shaped the young girl growing up in this contested borderland. France in 1425 seemed on the verge of complete English conquest. Henry V had died in 1422, but his infant son Henry VI had been proclaimed king of both England and France. The English regent, John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford, prosecuted the war with ruthless efficiency. By 1428, English forces had pushed deep into the Loire Valley. They laid siege to Orleans, the gateway to southern France. If Orleans fell, the way would be open to Bourges, and the last remnants of the Dauphin's kingdom would collapse. Into this desperate situation would come a teenage peasant girl claiming to hear voices from heaven. What she would accomplish in the span of just 2 years, from 1429 to 1431, would change the whole course of European history. But to understand Joan of Arc, we must first understand the particular circumstances of her birth, family, and early formation in the village of Domrémy. Joan of Arc was born on January 6, 1412, in Domrémy, a small village in northeastern France. The exact date of her birth is not certain, but this date, the Feast of the Epiphany, has traditionally been accepted. She was baptized in the Church of Saint Remy, which still stands in the village. At her baptism, she received the name Johanna, which would be rendered as Joan in English. Her surname underwent various spellings throughout her short life: Dark, Dark, Tark, Day, and others. At her trial, her father's name was recorded as Tart. The apostrophe in Dark was not consistently used during the medieval period. She herself never signed documents, being illiterate, and referred to herself simply as Johanna la Pucelle, Joan the Maid. Her father was Jacques d'Arc, a peasant farmer who owned approximately 50 acres of land. This made the family relatively prosperous by peasant standards. They were not serfs bound to a lord's estate, but free peasants who owned their land. Jacques also served as a minor village official, a position of some respect in the small community. He was known as a serious, hard-working man devoted to his family and his land. Her mother was Isabelle Romay, also known as Isabelle de Vouton. Isabelle was a pious woman who would teach Joan her prayers and instill in her a deep Catholic faith. The name Romay indicated that someone in her family had made a pilgrimage to Rome, a significant undertaking in that era. Joan had 4 siblings. Her 3 brothers were Jacquemin, sometimes called Jacques, Jean and Pierre. She also had a sister named Catherine. Joan was not the youngest child, but somewhere in the middle of this brood. The Dark household was a busy, bustling place typical of a medieval peasant family. Everyone worked. From an early age, Joan participated in the daily labour required to sustain the family. Her childhood, by all accounts from witnesses at her later trials, appeared entirely ordinary for a peasant girl of that time and place. Joan helped her mother with household chores. She learned to spin wool, becoming particularly skilled at it. She developed expertise as a seamstress, a talent that would be remembered by those who knew her in her youth. She helped care for the family's animals, sometimes taking them to pasture, though she testified later that this was not her primary responsibility. Her father and brothers handled most of the fieldwork, but during crucial times like harvest, everyone pitched in. Unlike the boys, Joan received no formal education. She never learned to read or write. This was typical for peasant children, especially girls in medieval France. Education was the province of the clergy and the nobility. What Joan did receive was religious instruction from her mother. Isabelle taught her daughter the basics: prayers, the Our Father, the Hail Mary, the Creed. She taught her about the saints, about the Virgin Mary, about proper devotion and comportment. Joan absorbed these lessons with unusual fervour. All witnesses from Domrémy who later testified about Joan during her rehabilitation trial decades after her death remembered her as exceptionally pious, even as a young child. Horviette, a childhood friend, recalled that Joan was good, simple and sweet-natured. She said Joan went to church often and was devout beyond what was typical for village children. Menguette, another friend, testified that Joan was so pious that she and other girls would tease her about it, saying Joan was too devout. Gérardin of Épinal, who had known her since childhood, said she was a good Catholic, attended church gladly, and often went to the Hermitage Chapel of Notre Dame de Beaumont with her sister Catherine, bringing candles to honour the Virgin Mary. But Joan was not merely pious. She was also described as cheerful, good with other children, and helpful. She played games with the village children. In the meadows and hills around Domrémy, there was an ancient tree called the Fairy Tree, or the Lady's Tree. It was an enormous beech tree where village youth would gather, especially on L'été Sunday, the fourth Sunday of Lent. They would sing, dance, and make garlands of flowers. Local folklore held that fairies had once visited the tree. Joan participated in these innocent festivities like any other village child, though she apparently did not stay as late as some of the others, preferring to return home or to church. Her confessor later testified that Joan came to confession frequently, more often than required. She attended Mass whenever possible. The church bell of Saint-Rémy was a constant presence in her life. She later testified that she loved the sound of church bells and was upset when the bell ringer was late in his duties. This detail reveals something of her personality. Serious, devout, perhaps a bit particular about things being done properly. These were the characteristics that childhood neighbours remembered. The village of Domrémy itself was small, perhaps 200 to 300 inhabitants at most. It lay in a valley beside the Meuse River, surrounded by fields and forests. The landscape was beautiful, with rolling hills, meadows where cattle grazed, and woodlands where villagers could gather fuel and hunt. But the beauty was deceptive. This was a dangerous frontier region. The constant warfare meant that soldiers, brigands, and armed bands roamed the countryside. The villagers had to be perpetually vigilant. Joan herself later mentioned that when she was growing up, the village had to move its livestock to the fortified castle of the island for protection when threats emerged. This constant state of insecurity shaped the mindset of people living in such regions. They understood that the war was not some abstract political conflict, but a daily reality that could destroy their lives at any moment. The attack on Domrémy in 1425 when Joan was 13 made this reality immediate and personal. Houses were burned, property was stolen, the villagers felt violated, vulnerable, angry. It was shortly after this traumatic event that Joan had her first vision. Later at her trial, she would be questioned extensively about these visions, forced to describe them before hostile judges who sought to prove they were demonic rather than divine. But in 1425, in her father's garden on a summer day around noon, Joan had an experience that would change her life and eventually change history. She saw a great light and heard a voice. She was terrified. She was only 13 years old, a peasant girl who knew nothing of the wider world beyond her village. What happened next would set her on a path that seemed impossible for someone of her station, age, and sex. Joan of Arc's visions have been analysed, debated, and interpreted for nearly 600 years. Were they genuine divine communications, hallucinations, psychological phenomena born from religious fervour and trauma, deliberate fabrications? The question has occupied theologians, historians, psychologists, and countless others. What we know for certain is what Joan herself testified, particularly at her trial in 1431, though she was reluctant to speak of these experiences and refused to answer many questions about them, insisting they were too sacred and personal. She testified that her first vision occurred when she was about 13 years old, around 1425. It was a summer day, around noon. She was in her father's garden, a small plot of ground between the family house and the church. She saw a great brilliant light toward her right side, toward the church. In that light appeared a figure she later identified as the Archangel Michael. She also saw other angels with him. Joan was frightened. She was just a young girl, and this appearance overwhelmed her. She did not know what was happening to her. The vision faded, but it returned again and again in the following days and weeks. As Joan became accustomed to the visions, her fear gave way to comfort and even joy. St. Michael spoke to her. He told her to be a good girl, to go to church often, to live piously. He told her that God would help her. He also told her that St. Catherine and St. Margaret would visit her, that these female saints would guide her ear, and that she must obey their words. Though Joan never precisely specified which St. Catherine and which St. Margaret she meant, scholars believe she referred to Catherine of Alexandria and Margaret of Antioch. Both were virgin martyrs, women who had resisted powerful enemies, endured torture, and died for their faith while maintaining their virtue. Their stories were well known in medieval France. Images of them would have been in the church Joan attended. After St. Michael's initial appearances, Saints Catherine and Margaret began visiting Joan regularly. She testified that they came at least once or twice a week. Sometimes she heard the voices when the church bells rang. She said the voices came from her right side, usually accompanied by a great light. She rarely heard the voices without seeing the light. When they left her, she wept because she wanted them to take her with her. She embraced them. She testified that they had a sweet, beautiful scent. These details suggest experiences of overwhelming intensity and seeming reality to Joan. The content of the messages evolved over time. At first, the voices simply encouraged her to be good and pious, but gradually the messages became more specific and more demanding. The voices told her she must go to France, meaning the territory controlled by the Dauphin as opposed to the English-occupied regions. They told her she had a mission of overwhelming importance. She must save France from the English. She must raise the siege that would be laid to the city of Orleans. She must lead the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation. These were extraordinary, impossible tasks for anyone, let alone an illiterate teenage peasant girl who had never ventured far from her village. Joan struggled with these commands. She later testified that she did not immediately tell anyone about her visions. For several years she kept them secret. She was afraid. She knew how impossible the task seemed. She asked her voices how she, a poor girl who knew nothing of riding horses or fighting, could possibly accomplish such things. The voices told her that God would help her, that she must have courage, that she must trust in the divine plan. As Joan grew older, the urgency of the voices increased. By the time she was 16, around 1428, they were insisting that she must act. She must go to Vaucouleurs, a nearby town that remained loyal to the Dauphin, and there she must ask the garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, to give her an escort to see the Dauphin. Joan resisted. She was terrified of leaving her family, her village, everything she knew. But the voices gave her no peace. They appeared frequently, always urging her, always insisting that this was God's will. One detail of Joan's visions that would later cause problems at her trial was her claim that the voices told her specific military and political information that she could not have known by ordinary means. She said the voices told her about the English attack on the French convoy at the Battle of the Herrings in February 1429, even though this battle occurred far from Domrémy. This apparent foreknowledge impressed Robert de Baudricourt and helped convince him that Joan was genuine. However, at her trial, her enemies would argue that such knowledge could only come from demonic sources, not divine ones. Joan's visions occurred at a time when such phenomena were not considered unusual in medieval Catholicism. Many holy people, particularly women, reported visions, voices, and mystical experiences. Female visionaries were a noted feature of late medieval religious life. The Church viewed such claims with caution, requiring examination to determine if they were genuine divine communications or deceptions by the devil. But the possibility of direct divine communication was accepted in principle. Prophecies circulated throughout France during this period, including predictions that an armed virgin from the borders of Lorraine would save France. Whether Joan had heard such prophecies before her visions began is unknown, but they certainly prepared people to believe her claims. Joan's deep piety made her claims more credible to those who knew her. Her frequent confession, her devotion to Mass, her chastity and virtue were witnessed by everyone in Domrémy. She was known as exceptionally devout even before she began speaking of her mission. When a young man from the village later tried to claim that Joan had promised to marry him, she successfully defended herself before an ecclesiastical court, proving she had made no such promise. The court dismissed his case. Joan had already sworn a vow of virginity to her voices, she said. She would remain a virgin. This was essential to her mission and her identity as the Maid. By early 1428, when Joan was 16, the voices gave her no rest. She must go to Vaucouleurs, she must see Robert de Baudricourt, she must begin her mission. Joan finally confided in an uncle, Durand-Lassois, who lived in a village closer to Vaucouleurs. She convinced him to take her there. What she told him to persuade him to help is not recorded, but he agreed. In May 1428, Joan and her uncle travelled to Vaucouleurs. There, Joan requested an audience with Robert de Baudricourt, the garrison commander. Baudricourt's reaction was predictable. A teenage peasant girl appeared before him claiming that God had sent her to save France and that she needed an armed escort to travel through enemy territory to see the Dauphin. He laughed her away. He told Durand-Lassois to take the girl home and have her father box her ears. Joan returned to Domrémy, rejected and humiliated. But the voices did not let her give up. They insisted she must try again. She must persist. God would give her success. Joan returned to Vaucouleurs in January 1429. By this time, the situation in France had grown even more desperate. The English had laid siege to Orleans in October 1428. The city was on the verge of falling. If Orleans fell, The English path to complete conquest would be open. The Dauphin's cause seemed lost. People were desperate for hope, for a miracle, for anything that might turn the tide. Into this context came Joan, returning to Vaucouleurs with her impossible claims. This time, Joan's persistence and evident sincerity began to win people over. 2 soldiers, Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, met with her and were impressed by her conviction and piety. She told them with utter certainty that she would raise the siege of Orleans, would see the Dauphin crowned at Reims, would drive the English from France. Her quiet confidence was remarkable for a girl her age. She showed no doubt and no hesitation. She believed completely in her divine mission. Metz and Poulengy became convinced that she was telling the truth, or at least that she believed she was telling the truth. They supported her petition to Baudricourt. Then, in February 1429, something happened that finally convinced Baudricourt to give Joan her chance. News arrived of a French defeat at the Battle of the Herrings on February 12th. A French relief convoy heading to Orleans had been intercepted and defeated by English forces. Joan reportedly told Baudricourt about this defeat before messengers could have brought official word. How she knew if this account is accurate remains mysterious. She said her voices had told her. Whether this was genuine prescience, lucky timing, or later embellishment of the story, the effect was dramatic. Baudricourt now believed, or at least was willing to take a chance. He agreed to provide Joan with an escort, a horse, and men's clothing for the journey. The men's clothing was practical for travelling through dangerous territory and for riding horseback, but it would later become one of the central charges at her heresy trial. Wearing men's clothing was technically prohibited by scripture, specifically a passage in Deuteronomy, but Joan insisted she needed men's clothes for protection and practicality. She cut her hair short, donned a tunic, hose and boots, and prepared for the dangerous journey to Chinon, where the Dauphin held court. On February 13th, 1429, Joan left Vaucouleurs with her escort of 6 soldiers, Jean de Metz, Bertrand de Poulengy, and 4 others. They travelled at night for safety, crossing territory controlled by English and Burgundian forces. The journey covered approximately 300 miles and took 11 days. Joan showed remarkable endurance and courage. She had never ridden long distances before, yet she kept pace with experienced soldiers. She insisted they stop to attend Mass whenever possible. She maintained her piety and her chastity despite travelling in close company with men. The group reached Chinon on March 6, 1429. Joan requested an audience with the Dauphin Charles, but Charles was cautious, even suspicious. His court was full of schemers, opportunists, and people claiming to have answers to France's problems. A teenage peasant girl claiming to hear voices from God was just another strange supplicant as far as many courtiers were concerned, but rumours of Joan had preceded her. Stories of her visions, her predictions, her absolute conviction had spread. The desperate citizens of Orleans were already hoping she might be the saviour prophecies had foretold. Charles decided to receive her, if only out of curiosity. When Joan entered the Great Hall at Chinon on March 9th, Charles allegedly attempted to test her. He disguised himself as one of his courtiers and stood among them, while another man dressed in finer clothes to impersonate the king. According to the story, Joan immediately went to Charles, bowed low before him, and embraced his knees, saying, "God give you a happy life, sweet king." She recognised him despite having never seen him before, despite his attempt at disguise. This story may be true, or it may be later embellishment, but it impressed those present. More importantly, Joan and Charles had a private conversation. What they discussed has never been revealed in detail. Joan later told her confessor that she had reassured Charles that he was indeed the legitimate son of Charles VI and the rightful king of France. This was crucial because rumours circulated that Charles was illegitimate, that his mother had had an affair, that he had no valid claim to the throne. These doubts plagued Charles and undermined his authority. Joan apparently spoke to him with such conviction and provided such reassurances that Charles became convinced she was genuine. He made a strong impression on him. He felt hope for the first time in years, but Charles could not simply hand over command of an army to a teenage girl based on one conversation, no matter how impressive. He sent Joan to Poitiers, where theologians and clergy loyal to the Armagnac cause had gathered after Paris fell under English control. For 3 weeks, these learned men questioned Joan. They tested her orthodoxy, her knowledge of scripture, her motives. They tried to trick her, to trap her into saying something heretical or suspicious, but Joan, despite her lack of education, held her own. She answered with a peasant's common sense and with unwavering conviction in her divine mission. When asked for a sign that she was sent by God, she replied that this sign would be the lifting of the siege of Orleans. The theologians at Poitiers could find nothing wrong with Joan. They concluded that she was a good Catholic, pious and sincere. They could not definitively say whether her visions were from God, but they saw no evidence of evil or heresy. Given the desperate situation, they advised Charles that sending Joan to Orleans could do no harm and might provide the miracle France needed. At the very least, it would raise morale. Charles also had Joan physically examined by women, including his mother-in-law Yolande of Aragon. They verified that Joan was indeed a virgin, as she claimed. This was important because her identity as the Maid, as a virgin serving God, was central to her mission and her credibility. A virgin warrior was the subject of prophecies. Joan's virginity gave her mission religious legitimacy and protected her from certain accusations. Finally, Charles made his decision. He would send Joan to Orleans. He had her equipped with white armour, custom made for her frame. He provided her with a banner, white with golden fleur-de-lis and the names of Jesus and Mary. Joan insisted on carrying a banner rather than a sword in battle. She said she did not want to kill anyone, that she would carry the banner and inspire the troops, but she would not shed blood herself. She also requested a specific sword that she said her voices had told her could be found buried behind the altar in the church of St. Catherine de Fierbois. When the church was searched, such a sword was indeed found there, covered with rust. This discovery further enhanced Joan's reputation as someone with divine knowledge. Joan was given a squire, Jean d'Aulon, a page and heralds. She was assigned to join a convoy led by Marshal Jean de la Brosse that was preparing to carry supplies to besieged Orleans from the city of Blois. At Blois, Joan dictated letters to the English commanders besieging Orleans. These letters, which still survive, show remarkable confidence. Joan called herself Joan the Maid and ordered the English in God's name to surrender their fortifications and leave France. She told them that if they did not, she would make them leave. The English commanders received these letters with contempt and mockery. They called Joan a cowgirl, a whore, and said that if they caught her, they would burn her at the stake. But Joan was undeterred. She was 17 years old. She had never seen battle. She knew nothing of military strategy or warfare. She was a peasant girl who had left her village for the first time less than 2 months earlier, yet she carried herself with absolute conviction that God had sent her to save France. On April the 27th, 1429, Joan and the supply convoy left Blois for Orleans. She was about to face her first test. The siege of Orleans was the key to the entire war. If Joan failed there, she would be dismissed as a fraud and forgotten by history. If she succeeded, she would become legend. The city of Orleans stood as the last major barrier between English conquest and total domination of France in the spring of 1429. Located on the Loire River, the city controlled the main crossing point and the route southward into the Dauphin's remaining territory. If Orleans fell, the way would be open for English forces to march on Bourges and complete their conquest. The siege had begun on October 12, 1428, when English forces under Thomas de Montacute, Earl of Salisbury, surrounded the city. Salisbury was one of England's most capable commanders, but he was struck by a cannonball on November 3rd and died of his wounds several days later. Command passed to William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, and John Talbot, later Earl of Shrewsbury. The English strategy was to construct a ring of fortifications around Orleans to cut off supplies and reinforcements. They built bastilles, fortified outposts at key locations. The most important of these was Les Tourelles, a fortified gatehouse at the southern end of the bridge crossing the Loire. The English also built fortifications at Saint-Lô to the east, Saint-Laurent to the west, and several other strategic points. However, the English army was not large enough to completely surround the city. Gaps existed in their siege lines, particularly on the eastern side. This would prove crucial. Inside Orleans, the military situation was dire but not hopeless. The city had strong walls, numerous artillery pieces, and a garrison of about 2,000 troops under the command of Jean de Dunois, known as the Bastard of Orleans. Dunois was the illegitimate son of the late Duke of Orleans and was a capable commander. The city also had a population of perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 people, including refugees from the surrounding countryside. But after months of siege, supplies were running low, morale was declining, and there seemed little hope of relief. The English appeared on the verge of final victory. Into this desperate situation came the news in late April that a supply convoy from Blois was approaching, accompanied by a young peasant girl who claimed to be sent by God. The citizens of Orleans had heard rumours of Joan. Prophecies circulated that a virgin from the borders of Lorraine would save France. The people desperately wanted to believe in a miracle. When word spread that Joan was coming, hope surged through the city. On April 29, 1429, Joan reached Orleans. The approach required careful planning because English forces blocked the direct route. The convoy, heavily laden with supplies, approached from the south side of the Loire. The English held the southern end of the bridge at Les Tourelles, but the French still controlled the northern entrance. Dunois met Joan before she entered the city. He was sceptical at first, despite the stories he had heard. Here was a 17-year-old girl in white armour, carrying a banner, claiming she would raise the siege that had lasted for months. But when he spoke with her, Dunois found himself impressed by her conviction and her presence. A diversion was arranged. French troops sortied from Orleans against the English position at Saint-Lô on the eastern side, drawing English attention. Meanwhile, Joan and most of the supply convoy entered the city through the Burgundy Gate on the eastern side, which was less heavily besieged. Joan entered Orleans at about 8 in the evening. The reception was overwhelming. Thousands of citizens filled the streets, carrying torches, cheering, trying to touch her or her white horse. They saw her as their salvation. Joan was exhausted from the journey and overwhelmed by the response, but she maintained her composure. Joan met with the city's commanders and the Count of Dunois. She was frustrated to learn that they were planning cautious defensive operations. Joan insisted that they must attack, must take the offensive. Her voices had told her to attack the English fortifications directly. The experienced military commanders were dubious. They had fought this war for years. They knew the strength of English positions. They knew the formidable reputation of English longbowmen. But Joan's certainty was absolute. She argued with them, insisted that God would give them victory if they attacked boldly. The next few days saw tension between Joan and the military leadership. Joan wanted immediate action. The commanders wanted to wait for additional reinforcements. On May 4th, Joan learned that the French forces were planning an attack on the Bastille of Saint-Lô without informing her. She was angry at being excluded. She rushed to join the battle, which was already underway. Her presence galvanized the French troops. They redoubled their assault. After several hours of fierce fighting, Saint-Lô fell to the French. The English garrison was killed or captured. Joan was distressed to see the bloodshed, reportedly weeping for the English dead and hearing confessions from dying men. But the victory was significant. For the first time in months, the French had successfully taken an English fortification. The next day, May 5th, was Ascension Thursday, a major feast day. Joan insisted that no attack be made on this holy day. Instead, she dictated another letter to the English commanders, demanding their surrender. The letter was attached to an arrow and shot into the English lines. The English response was to shout insults, calling her a cowgirl and other vulgar names. Joan wept at their obstinacy, but she prepared for battle the next day. On May 6th, French forces attacked the Bastille of Saint-Jean-le-Blanc on the south bank of the Loire. The English abandoned this position and retreated to a stronger fortification called Les Augustins. Joan and the French army crossed the Loire on boats and attacked Les Augustins. The fighting was intense. At one point, French forces began to retreat. Joan rallied them, leading by example, shouting encouragement, holding her banner high. The soldiers found new courage seeing the Maid fearlessly advancing. They turned back and renewed the assault. After hours of combat, Les Augustins fell to the French. The way was now open to attack the main English stronghold at Les Tourelles. That evening, military commanders argued about what to do next. Many wanted to pause, consolidate gains, wait for more reinforcements. Joan argued vehemently for an immediate attack on Les Tourelles. She said her voices told her she would be wounded in the next battle but would survive. She insisted they must attack the next day. Finally, the commanders agreed, moved by Joan's conviction and by the successes of the past days. May 7th, 1429, would be the decisive day of the siege. At dawn, French forces prepared for an all-out assault on Les Tourelles. This fortification was formidable, consisting of a large tower and walls at the southern end of the broken bridge over the Loire. The English had garrisoned it with several hundred of their best troops under the command of William Glasdale. To take Les Tourelles, meant attacking across open ground under fire from English archers and Pierre Cauchon cannon. The assault began early in the morning. French troops advanced with scaling ladders, attempting to climb the walls under a hail of arrows and stones. Joan was in the thick of the fighting, carrying her banner, encouraging the soldiers. Around midday, as she stood at the base of the wall holding a scaling ladder, an English arrow pierced her between her neck and shoulder, above her breast. The wound was serious. The arrow penetrated several inches into her flesh. Joan fell back, crying out in pain. She was carried away from the fighting. Soldiers and physicians gathered around her. They wanted to treat the wound with a magical charm, a practice common in medieval medicine. Joan refused, saying such charms were sinful. Instead, she allowed them to dress the wound with olive oil and bandages. She wept from pain and fear. She prayed. Some accounts say she briefly considered withdrawing from the battle. But after resting and praying, Joan returned to the fighting. Her wound was still bleeding, but she picked up her banner and went back to the walls. When the French soldiers saw Joan return, wounded but undaunted, they were inspired to a frenzy. They renewed the assault with tremendous energy. The fighting continued through the afternoon. Joan climbed near the walls, holding her banner, shouting that Les Tourelles would be taken. At one point, her banner was struck by an arrow or stone and fell. A soldier named Guillaume de Gamache retrieved it. The French brought up cannons and bombarded the walls at close range. They brought fire and threw it at the wooden barriers the English had erected. As evening approached, Dunois considered calling off the assault. The attack had been going on for nearly 12 hours. The French had suffered heavy casualties. Dunois told Joan they should retreat and try again the next day. Joan asked for just a little more time. She took her banner and advanced close to the walls again. She planted it in the ground and called on the French to make one more assault. At that moment, a cannonball or some projectile struck the fortification, causing part of the wall to collapse. French soldiers surged through the breach. The English defence began to crumble. William Glasdale and other English commanders tried to retreat across the drawbridge to the remaining portion of the bridge, but the French had set fire to the drawbridge. As Glasdale and several others tried to cross, the burning drawbridge collapsed. They fell into the Loire River, weighed down by their armour, and drowned. Joan reportedly shouted to Glasdale, calling him by name, begging him to surrender to save his soul. But her warning came too late. The English commander disappeared beneath the water. Les Tourelles fell. The remaining English soldiers surrendered or fled. The French had achieved a stunning victory. The next morning, May 8th, the remaining English forces outside Orleans prepared for battle. They drew up in formation, apparently ready to contest the French. Joan and the French army emerged from the city and also formed up for battle. For about an hour, the two armies faced each other. But then the English began to withdraw. They abandoned their remaining fortifications and marched away from Orleans. The siege was lifted. The people of Orleans were ecstatic. Church bells rang throughout the city. The citizens poured into the streets celebrating, weeping with joy, praising God and praising Joan. She had arrived just 9 days earlier. In that time, she had led French forces to victory after victory, culminating in the lifting of a siege that had lasted more than 6 months. The psychological impact was enormous. The English, who had seemed invincible, had been defeated. The French, who had known only defeat and despair for so long, had won a miraculous victory. Joan herself attributed all credit to God. She insisted that she was merely God's instrument. But to the French people, she had become a symbol of hope and divine favour. The Maid of Orleans, as she was now called, had done what experienced generals and nobles could not do. She had turned the tide of the war. But Orleans was just the beginning. Joan's mission, as her voices had told her, was not yet complete. She must now lead the Dauphin to Reims for his coronation. She must see him anointed as the rightful king of France. The victory at Orleans transformed the war's momentum. For years, the English had seemed unstoppable. Now they had been defeated by an army inspired by a teenage girl claiming divine guidance. Word of the miracle spread throughout France and beyond. Songs were written about the Maid. Poems celebrated her deeds. The people saw Joan as proof that God favoured the French cause, that Charles was the rightful king, that France would be saved from English domination. But Joan understood that military victories alone would not secure Charles's throne. Her voices had told her that Charles must be crowned at Reims, the traditional coronation site for French kings. For centuries, French monarchs had been anointed with holy oil in the great cathedral at Reims. This sacred ceremony conferred legitimacy and divine approval. Without it, Charles remained merely the Dauphin, a claimant whose authority many questioned. With it, he would become King Charles VII, anointed by God the legitimate sovereign of France. There was one enormous problem. Reims lay deep in enemy territory. The English and Burgundians controlled the entire region between the Loire and Reims. To reach the city, Charles and his army would have to march through hundreds of miles of hostile territory, past fortified towns and enemy garrisons. The military commanders at Charles's court considered the plan foolish, even suicidal. They urged a more cautious approach, consolidating gains in the Loire Valley, perhaps campaigning in Normandy. But Joan insisted with her characteristic certainty. They must go to Reims. God would give them victory. Charles must be crowned. Before the march to Reims could begin, Joan argued for clearing the remaining English strongholds along the Loire. Several fortified towns and castles still held English garrisons that threatened communications and supply lines. Joan advocated for an offensive campaign to liberate these positions. Charles and his council agreed, and in June 1429, French forces began what would become known as the Loire Campaign. The first target was Jargeau, a town on the Loire, held by the Duke of Suffolk with a garrison of several hundred English soldiers. The French army, with Joan prominently present, approached Jargeau on June 11th. Suffolk refused to surrender. Joan urged an immediate assault. Some commanders argued for a longer siege, but Joan insisted God would give them victory if they attacked boldly. On June 12th, French forces stormed the town. Joan was again in the thick of the fighting, holding her banner at the walls. At one point, a stone thrown from the battlement struck her helmet and knocked her to the ground. She quickly recovered and urged the soldiers onward. After fierce fighting, Jargeau fell. Suffolk was captured. The victory reinforced Joan's reputation and the army's morale. Next came the town of Meung-sur-Loire. The French army approached on June 15th and quickly took the town, though the English garrison held out in the fortified bridge. Rather than invest time in a prolonged siege, Joan urged moving on to the more important target of Beaugency, another fortified town nearby. The French surrounded Beaugency on June 16th. The English garrison, hearing of the disaster at Jargeau and knowing they were outnumbered, soon offered to surrender if they could withdraw safely. The French agreed, and Beaugency was peacefully occupied on June 18th. But the most significant battle of the Loire Campaign was yet to come. An English army under John Fastolf had been marching south to relieve the besieged English garrisons. This force numbered perhaps 5,000 men, a substantial army by the standards of the 100 Years' War. When English scouts reported that Jargeau and Beaugency had fallen and that a large French force was in the area, the English commanders debated what to do. John Talbot, one of England's most respected commanders, argued for withdrawing to Paris, but Fastolf advocated for confronting the French. The English army continued forward. On June 18th, French scouts reported that the English army was nearby, moving north. The French commanders immediately wanted to pursue. Joan enthusiastically supported attack. The French army, numbering perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 men, gave chase. On the morning of June 18th, near the village of Patay, French scouts located the English army. The English were attempting to establish a defensive position, as they had so successfully done at Agincourt and other battles. English longbowmen were the most feared troops in Europe. Their longbows could pierce armour at long range, and English tactics typically involved taking strong defensive positions and massacring attacking forces with arrow storms. But at Patay, circumstances favoured the French. The English were not yet fully deployed in their defensive formation. French cavalry, led by commanders like Jean de Dunois and Jean d'Alençon, with Joan riding with them, launched a rapid assault. The speed of the attack caught the English unprepared. Their archers had not yet set up their protective stakes. The French cavalry crashed into the English lines before they could form up properly. The Battle of Patay became a rout. The English army was shattered. Talbot was captured. Fastolf fled with a small remnant of troops. Somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 English soldiers were killed, while French casualties were minimal. Patay reversed Agincourt. For decades, English longbowmen had dominated battlefields. Now they had been crushed by a swift, aggressive French assault. Joan was present at the battle, though accounts differ on her exact role. She certainly inspired the French troops and may have counselled the aggressive tactics that proved so successful. With the Loire Campaign successfully concluded, and English power in the region broken, Joan renewed her insistence that Charles march to Reims for his coronation. Charles hesitated. His advisors were divided. Some argued for consolidating gains, others for attacking Paris or Normandy. But Joan would not relent. She told Charles that this was God's will, that he must be crowned at Reims to establish his legitimacy beyond question. Finally, Charles agreed. On June 29, 1429, the army left Guyenne and began the march to Reims. This was an extraordinary military and political gamble. The army would be marching deep into hostile territory. They would pass fortified towns garrisoned by English and Burgundian troops. They could be attacked from any direction. Supply lines would be stretched thin. If a major English army intercepted them, the entire force could be destroyed, and Charles with it. But Joan's conviction swayed the decision. The march to Reims began. The journey proved far easier than anyone expected. As the army advanced, towns and cities that had been loyal to the English or Burgundians opened their gates without resistance. Some surrendered after brief negotiations, others welcomed the French enthusiastically. The presence of Joan the Maid. The heroine of Orleans and Patay had enormous psychological impact. People saw her as a sign from God. Local garrisons facing a large army with the legendary Maid in its ranks chose not to resist. Auxerre opened its gates on July 3rd. Troyes, site of the humiliating treaty that had disinherited Charles, was reached on July 10th. This was a strongly fortified city with English and Burgundian garrisons. The city's commander refused to surrender. A siege began. Some of Charles's advisors urged withdrawing, arguing they could not afford to be bogged down in a lengthy siege. Joan argued for an assault. She told Charles that within 3 days they would enter the city. She supervised the preparation of fascines and other siege equipment. Her confidence impressed the soldiers and terrified the defenders. On July 10th, the city's leaders negotiated surrender. The gates opened, and Charles's army entered peacefully. Chalon-sur-Marne surrendered on July 14th. The army was now only about 30 miles from Reims. On July 16th, the army approached Reims itself. This was the moment Joan had been working toward for months. The city's inhabitants faced a difficult choice. Reims had been under Burgundian control, but the citizens were French, and the tradition of coronations at Reims was sacred to French identity. A delegation from the city met with Charles and Joan. After brief negotiations, Reims opened its gates on July 16th. Charles entered the city in triumph. Preparations for the coronation began immediately. The ceremony required specific regalia, much of which was in Paris or other cities. Substitutes were found. The Archbishop of Reims, Regnault de Chartres, would perform the ceremony. On July 17, 1429, Charles VII was crowned and anointed King of France in the Cathedral of Reims. The ceremony followed the ancient ritual. The holy oil kept in a sacred vial called the Holy Ampulla was used to anoint Charles. He was invested with the sword, sceptre, and other symbols of royal authority. He was crowned with the great crown of France. When the crown was placed on his head, trumpets sounded, and the assembled nobles and people shouted, "Noel! Noel!" in celebration. Throughout the ceremony, Joan stood near the altar holding her banner. She wept with joy. When asked later why her banner had been present at the coronation, she replied that it had been with her in the hardships, so it was right that it should be present at the moment of glory, and she had fulfilled the mission her voices had given her. She had raised the siege of Orleans. She had led Charles to Rouen. He was now the anointed King of France. God's plan, as revealed to a peasant girl in a garden in Domrémy, had been accomplished. After the coronation, Joan knelt before Charles and embraced his knees, weeping. She called him her king and said she had done what God commanded. Some accounts suggest that Joan felt her mission was complete, that she asked Charles for permission to return home to her village and family. She had never wanted glory or power. She had wanted only to obey God's commands, but Charles and his commanders would not release her. The war continued. The English still held Paris, Normandy, and other territories. Joan's presence inspired the army and terrified the enemy. She was France's greatest asset. Charles needed her to continue fighting. Joan agreed to stay, though perhaps with some reluctance. She had fulfilled the specific tasks her voices had assigned. What came next was less clear to her. She had doubts about the wisdom of some planned campaigns. Her relationship with some of the king's advisors, particularly Georges de la Trémoille, the king's chief minister, was strained. These men resented Joan's influence and her directness. They wanted to pursue diplomatic solutions with Burgundy rather than continued warfare. Joan advocated for aggressive military action. These tensions would shape the next phase of her brief career. The coronation at Reims changed the nature of the conflict. Charles was now the anointed king of France. His legitimacy was established in the eyes of God and in the traditions of French monarchy. The English claim, based on the Treaty of Troyes, was undermined. Henry VI of England was a foreign child whose authority rested on a treaty now widely seen as invalid and forced upon a mad king. The psychological and political advantages shifted decisively to the French side. Towns and nobles who had supported the English or remained neutral now reconsidered their positions. The tide of the war had turned, and Joan of Arc had been the catalyst for that transformation. After the triumph at Reims, Joan's fortunes began to change. The period from July 1429 to May 1430 saw her influence diminish, her advice increasingly ignored, and her military fortunes turn from victory to defeat. These months revealed the limits of Joan's power within the complex political and military environment of the French court, and they set the stage for her capture and ultimate fate. Charles VII, newly crowned and confident, faced pressure from his advisors to pursue negotiations with the Burgundians rather than continued military campaigns. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, was open to talks if Burgundy could be separated from its English alliance. The English position in France would become untenable. The king's chief minister, Georges de la Trémoille, strongly advocated for diplomacy. A 15-day truce was negotiated with Burgundy in late July. Joan opposed this truce. She distrusted the Burgundians and believed military pressure should be maintained. But her voice was one among many, and Charles listened to his political advisors. The army remained in the field, and Joan participated in a campaign toward Paris. She advocated for an assault on the capital, arguing that taking Paris would deal a decisive blow to English power. In late August and early September, French forces approached Paris. On September 8, 1429, Joan led an assault on the Saint-Honoré Gate on the northern side of the city. She personally supervised filling in the moat, advancing close to the walls under heavy fire from defenders. An arrow or crossbow bolt struck her in the thigh. The wound was painful but not life-threatening. Joan refused to withdraw, insisting the assault continue. But as night fell, the assault had failed. The defences were too strong and reinforcements did not arrive as expected. Charles ordered the army to withdraw from Paris. Joan was bitterly disappointed. She believed that with more time and commitment, Paris could have been taken. But Charles and his advisors had other priorities. They wanted to pursue negotiations with Burgundy. Military campaigns were expensive and risky. The King's Council preferred diplomacy. Joan's aggressive military instincts were increasingly at odds with the cautious political approach favoured by the court. Joan was kept with the army but given less autonomy. In the fall and the winter of 1429 and into 1430, she participated in several small campaigns and sieges. In November, French forces besieged the town of La Charité-sur-Loire, which was held by a notorious mercenary captain allied with the Burgundians. Joan participated in this siege, but after several weeks of effort, the siege failed. The army lacked sufficient artillery and supplies. They withdrew in late December without taking the town. This failure contrasted sharply with Joan's earlier successes and damaged her reputation for invincibility. Despite these setbacks, Charles rewarded Joan and her family with ennoblement in December 1429. Joan, her parents and her brothers were elevated to the nobility. Her family was granted a coat of arms featuring a sword, a crown and fleur-de-lis. Joan herself cared little for such honours. She accepted them politely but showed no interest in titles or wealth. She lived simply, maintained her piety and her chastity, and focused on what she saw as her continuing mission to drive the English from France. In the spring of 1430, military campaigning resumed. The truce with Burgundy had accomplished little. Burgundian forces remained allied with England, and fighting continued across northern France. Joan rejoined active military operations, serving with various French captains in the region around the Oise and Aisne rivers, northeast of Paris. She was no longer the central figure directing strategy, but rather one commander among several attached to the royal army but not always consulted on major decisions. In May 1430, Burgundian forces besieged the town of Compiègne, a strategic location on the Oise River that remained loyal to Charles VII. The town's commander, Guillaume de Flavy, called for reinforcements. Joan was among those who responded. She arrived at Compiègne with a force of several hundred soldiers on May 14th. For the next several days, she participated in skirmishes around the town trying to harass the besieging Burgundian forces. On May 23, 1430, Joan led a sortie out of Compiègne against the Burgundian camp. It was late afternoon. She took several hundred soldiers and attacked Burgundian positions at the nearby village of Margny. The attack initially made progress, driving back Burgundian forces, but English reinforcements arrived and counterattacked. The situation turned against the French. Joan ordered a fighting retreat back to Compiègne. As French forces fell back toward the town, disaster struck. The timing of the retreat was poorly coordinated. Many soldiers reached the gates and entered the town, but Joan and her rearguard were still outside fighting to cover the retreat. Guillaume de Flavy, fearing that Burgundian troops would force their way into the town if the gates remained open, ordered them raised. The drawbridge was lifted. Joan and several dozen soldiers were trapped outside the walls. Burgundian and English soldiers swarmed around the trapped French. Joan fought fiercely, refusing to surrender. She was wearing rich armour and was clearly a person of importance. Burgundian soldiers recognised her. They were determined to capture her alive. She was pulled from her horse by an archer in the service of Jean de Luxembourg, a Burgundian nobleman. She was taken prisoner along with her brother Pierre d'Arc, Jean d'Aulon, her squire, and several others. The capture of Joan of Arc was enormous news. The English and Burgundians celebrated. Parisians danced in the streets. The University of Paris, which was controlled by English sympathisers, sent letters demanding that Joan be handed over for trial as a heretic. The Duke of Burgundy took personal possession of Joan, viewing her as a valuable prisoner. Joan was moved to various castles and fortifications in Burgundian territory. She was kept in chains, guarded constantly. Charles VII made no significant effort to ransom Joan or negotiate her release. This failure remains controversial. Charles had immense debts to Joan. She had been instrumental in his coronation and in reviving French fortunes, yet he did nothing substantive to save her. Whether this was due to political calculations, influence of advisers who disliked Joan, lack of funds, or simple callousness is debated by historians. Joan later testified that she had attempted to escape from her captivity, jumping from a tower at Beaurevoir Castle. She fell 60 or 70 feet and was badly injured but survived. She said her voices had told her not to jump, but she could not bear captivity and feared being handed over to the English. By late 1430, negotiations for Joan's fate were underway. The English were willing to pay an enormous ransom of 10,000 francs for Joan, equivalent to a king's ransom in that era. They wanted her for trial. The English had been humiliated by Joan. They needed to destroy her reputation, to prove she was not sent by God but by the devil. If Joan was a heretic and a witch, then all her victories were products of demonic assistance, and Charles's coronation was illegitimate. The political stakes were immense. In January 1431, Jean de Luxembourg sold Joan to the English. She was transferred to English custody and taken to Rouen, the English headquarters in France. There she would face trial before an ecclesiastical court, charged with heresy, witchcraft, and other offences. The outcome of the trial was never really in doubt. The English wanted Joan condemned and executed. They would use the forms of justice, but the verdict was predetermined. Joan's ordeal was about to reach its terrible conclusion. Joan of Arc arrived in Rouen in late December 1430. The city served as the headquarters for English power in northern France. The Norman capital had been in English hands since 1419. The young King Henry VI of England was not present, but his regent John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford, controlled the occupation. Bedford had a personal stake in Joan's destruction. She had humiliated English forces, broken the siege of Orleans, facilitated Charles VII's coronation, and reversed English momentum in the war. If she was proven to be a heretic and witch, her accomplishments could be attributed to satanic assistance rather than divine favour, thereby restoring English legitimacy. The trial was organised as an ecclesiastical proceeding, not a secular criminal trial. The formal charge was heresy, a religious crime that fell under church jurisdiction. To lead the prosecution, the English selected Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais. Cauchon was a skilled cleric and lawyer, strongly pro-English and pro-Burgundian in his sympathies. He had lost his bishopric when Beauvais declared for Charles VII, so he had personal reasons to hate Joan and the French cause. Cauchon assembled a tribunal of dozens of clerics, theologians, and lawyers. Most were French but were supporters of the English cause. The University of Paris, which backed the English claim, provided many of the learned assessors. Joan was imprisoned in a secular prison in Rouen Castle rather than in an ecclesiastical prison. This violated standard procedure for church trials. She was guarded by English soldiers who remained in her cell even at night. This was humiliating and threatening for a young woman who had maintained her virginity as central to her identity and mission. She repeatedly requested to be moved to a church prison where she could be guarded by women, but her requests were denied. She was kept in chains, sometimes shackled to a wooden beam. Her treatment was harsh, designed to break her spirit. The trial began officially on January 9, 1431, with preliminary proceedings. The formal interrogations of Joan began on February 21st and continued through late March. The sessions were held in various locations in Rouen, sometimes in a chapel, sometimes in prison. Dozens of clerics attended, questioning Joan for hours at a time. The proceedings were conducted in Latin, which Joan did not understand, though her responses were translated. Notaries recorded everything. These records, which survive, provide detailed documentation of Joan's trial and her testimony. Joan faced her interrogators with remarkable courage and intelligence. She was 19 years old, a peasant with no education, facing learned theologians and lawyers who were determined to destroy her. She had no legal counsel, no one to advise her on how to answer tricky questions, yet she defended herself with wit, common sense, and an unshakable faith in her divine mission. When asked to swear an oath to tell the truth about everything, Joan replied that she would answer truthfully about matters relevant to the trial, but would not reveal everything about her visions, saying some things were too sacred to discuss in such a setting. When asked her name, she replied that in her village she was called Johanna, and in France she was called Johanna the Maid. When asked if she was in a state of grace, a theological trap question that could not be answered safely, Joan gave one of the most famous replies in history. "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." This answer was perfect. It was humble, pious, and avoided the trap. If she had said yes, she would have been guilty of presumption. If she had said no, she would have condemned herself. The trial focused on several main charges. First, Joan's claim to have visions and hear voices from saints. The prosecutors attempted to prove these were demonic delusions rather than divine revelations. They questioned her extensively about the nature of the visions, what the saints looked like, what they said, whether she saw them naked or clothed, whether she had touched them. Joan answered some questions but refused to answer others, saying they were too personal, or that she had not been given permission by her voices to reveal certain details. Second, Joan was charged with wearing men's clothing. This violated a passage in Deuteronomy that prohibited cross-dressing. Joan defended herself by saying she wore men's clothes for practical reasons, for protection when travelling with soldiers, for modesty because her voices had told her to wear them. She said she would gladly wear women's clothing if she could be moved to a church prison and guarded by women. But as long as she was imprisoned with male guards, she needed men's clothing for protection. Third, Joan was accused of refusing to submit to the authority of the church and militant, meaning the institutional church on earth. This was the most serious charge. Medieval theology held that individual revelation must be tested and validated by church authority. By insisting that her voices came directly from God and by refusing to submit her visions to the judgment of the church hierarchy, Joan was accused of being schismatic and heretical. The prosecutors repeatedly demanded that Joan submit to the church. She replied that she submitted to God and to the saints who guided her. She said she could not deny her voices even if the church commanded it, because she knew they came from God. Joan's logic was unassailable from her perspective, but dangerous theologically. She was asserting that personal divine revelation could supersede institutional church authority. This was the kind of thinking that would fuel the Protestant Reformation a century later. In 1431, it was clearly heretical to the Orthodox Catholic theologians judging her. The interrogations were exhausting. Joan was questioned for hours, sometimes twice daily. She was ill, suffering from the conditions of her imprisonment. She was threatened with torture, though there is no evidence she was actually tortured. The goal was to break her down, to force her to recant her visions and admit she had been deceived by demons. Joan refused to break. She maintained her testimony. She said she would rather die than renounce her voices. By early April, the prosecutors had compiled their evidence into 70 articles of accusation. These were later reduced to 12 main charges. The charges included heresy, schism, idolatry concerning her claim to know God favoured the French, blasphemy for claiming certainty about her salvation, wearing men's clothes, and refusing to submit to church authority. On May 9th, Joan was threatened with being put to the torture. She replied that even if they tore her limbs apart, she would not say anything different than what she had already said, and if she did recant under torture, she would afterwards say she had been forced to lie. On May 23rd, Joan was taken to the cemetery of Saint-Ouen Abbey in Rouen. A scaffold had been erected. A large crowd gathered. Pierre Cauchon and other clerics were present, along with English soldiers and officials. A preacher delivered a sermon condemning Joan. Then Cauchon read the sentence. Joan was a heretic, and she would be handed over to the secular authorities for execution by burning. At this moment, facing imminent death, Joan's resolve apparently broke. The exact events are disputed because the trial records were likely altered afterward, but the general outline is clear. Joan was presented with a document of abjuration, a recantation of her errors. She was told that if she signed this document, she would be spared execution and instead would receive life imprisonment with the possibility of attending Mass and receiving communion. Joan, exhausted and terrified, apparently agreed. She may not have fully understood the document as it was in Latin. She made a mark on the paper or signed with help. Joan was returned to prison. She was still wearing men's clothing, but she was given a woman's dress. The English soldiers were furious that she had been spared execution. They had paid 10,000 francs for her and wanted her dead. Over the next few days, something happened that would seal Joan's fate. By May 28th, Joan was again wearing men's clothing. The reasons for this are disputed. Joan later testified that she had been forced to wear men's clothes because her dress had been taken away, and she needed protection from guards who may have tried to assault her sexually. English guards claim she voluntarily resumed male clothing. Whatever the circumstances, wearing men's clothing after having abjured it was proof of being a relapsed heretic. Church law held that someone who recanted heresy but then returned to their errors was beyond redemption and must be executed. On May 28th, Cauchon and other clerics returned to Joan's cell. They found her in men's clothing. Joan told them that she had been wrong to recant, that her voices had come back and told her she had sinned by denying them to save her life. She said she would rather die than continue to deny the truth of her visions. This was proof of relapse. Joan was condemned as a relapsed heretic. The sentence was death by burning. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan was led from her cell to the old market square in Rouen. A large crowd had gathered. 3 scaffolds had been erected, one for church and secular dignitaries, one for Joan, and one holding the stake where she would be burned. Joan asked to receive the sacraments despite her status as a relapsed heretic. Normally, such a request would be denied, but Pierre Cauchon granted her permission to make confession and receive communion. This was unprecedented. Some historians suggest that Cauchon genuinely believed he was saving her soul by allowing her final confession. 2 Dominican friars accompanied her to the old market square. Joan was weeping, she was terrified. English soldiers surrounded her, many laughing and mocking, as she prayed frantically. The sentence was read aloud to the assembled crowd. She was declared a relapsed heretic and was being handed over to the secular authorities for execution. Joan cried out for mercy. She begged for her judges to reconsider, but the verdict was final. One English soldier took pity on the 19-year-old girl. He fashioned a crude cross from 2 sticks and handed it to her. Joan kissed it and placed it against her chest. A proper processional crucifix was brought from the church of Saint-Sauveur. She embraced it, and as she was led to the stake, a Dominican friar held the crucifix high so she could see it throughout her ordeal. Joan was bound to a tall wooden stake. The stake was deliberately high, set on a platform above the crowd. This meant that the executioner could not strangle her before lighting the fire, a small mercy sometimes granted to condemned prisoners. The English wanted her to burn fully, wanted the crowd to witness her complete destruction. They wanted no relics to remain that might become objects of veneration. The pyre was lit. As the flames rose around her, Joan called out repeatedly, "Jesus! Jesus! Jesus!" Some accounts say she cried out for holy water. She asked the Dominican friar to hold the crucifix high so she could see it above the flames. She maintained until the very end that her voices came from God, that they had not deceived her. She died crying out the name of Jesus. her eyes fixed on the crucifix held before her. The execution was brutal and prolonged. Her clothes burned away, her body was consumed by fire. When the flames died down, the English commanders ordered the executioner to pull back the embers so the crowd could see that she was truly dead. They wanted no rumours that she had escaped or been saved by divine intervention. Her charred body was displayed to the assembled crowd. Then the fire was rekindled and her remains were burned again, reduced to ashes. Finally, the ashes and whatever fragments remained were thrown into the Seine River. The English wanted nothing left of Joan of Arc that could become a focus for devotion or resistance. But even in the immediate aftermath, doubts troubled some of those present. The executioner himself later reportedly told his friends and family that he feared he was damned for burning a holy woman. He said that despite the intense heat of the fire, Joan's heart had remained intact among the ashes, resisting the flames. Whether this story was true or legend, it reflected the sense among many witnesses that something terrible and sacrilegious had just occurred. Jean Trésor, secretary to King Henry VI of England, was heard to say as he left the execution, "We are lost, we have burned a saint." Many in the crowd wept. Not all present believed they had witnessed the just punishment of a heretic. Some believed they had watched the murder of an innocent woman, perhaps even a martyr. A few days after the execution, the English government and the University of Paris formally published news of Joan's death. They presented it as the just punishment of a heretic and a warning to others who might claim false divine inspiration. But the execution did not have the effect the English hoped for. Joan's death did not demoralise the French. If anything, it strengthened their resolve. She had become a martyr for France, proof of English cruelty. Her memory inspired continued resistance. Charles VII, despite owing his throne in large part to Joan, made no immediate effort to clear her name. For nearly 2 decades he remained officially silent about her fate. Perhaps he was constrained by political considerations. Perhaps he was uncertain about how to address the fact that his kingship had been achieved with the help of someone condemned as a heretic. But Joan's family and supporters did not forget. Her mother, Isabelle Romay, never stopped seeking justice for her daughter, and as French victories continued and English power waned, the opportunity to revisit Joan's trial finally emerged. Joan of Arc died on May 30th, 1431, but her story did not end with her execution. The years immediately following her death saw the war continue, though without the dramatic French reversals that had marked Joan's campaigns. English power gradually weakened. The Burgundians, crucial allies of England, began to reconsider their position. On September 21, 1435, just 4 years after Joan's death, Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy signed the Treaty of Arras with Charles VII. Burgundy abandoned its English alliance and reconciled with France. This diplomatic shift was catastrophic for England's position in France. With Burgundy now neutral or supportive, Charles VII could focus his efforts on reconquering territories held by the English. Throughout the 1440s, French armies steadily recovered ground. Town after town that had been under English control for decades returned to French allegiance. The momentum that Joan had initiated at Orleans continued. By 1449, French forces had reconquered most of Normandy. In November 1449, Charles VII entered Rouen, the city where Joan had been tried and executed. This created an opportunity. With Rouen in French hands, the documents from Joan's trial were now accessible. Charles had personal and political reasons to revisit Joan's conviction. Her condemnation as a heretic implied that Charles's coronation had been achieved through the assistance of a heretic, which undermined his legitimacy. If Joan could be proven innocent, if her trial could be shown to be unjust, then Charles's position would be strengthened and the English propaganda value of her conviction would be destroyed. On February 15, 1450, just a few months after recapturing Rouen, Charles VII ordered Guillaume Bouillet, a theologian and former rector of the University of Paris, to open an inquest into Joan's trial. This initial inquiry was limited in scope. Over several months, Bouillet questioned 7 witnesses, including some who had been involved in the original trial. Jean Beaupère, who had been one of Joan's principal interrogators in 1431, testified. 4 Dominican friars who had witnessed the trial also gave testimony, along with 2 priests. Guillaume Manchon, who had served as the chief notary at the trial, provided crucial information about irregularities in the proceedings. The witnesses testified that the trial had been conducted unjustly. They described how the English had pressured the judges, how evidence had been manipulated, how Joan had been denied proper legal counsel. Nicholas Bailly, who had been commissioned in 1431 to gather evidence against Joan in her home village of Domrémy, testified that he had found nothing wrong with her. He said he had found nothing about Joan that he would not have liked to find about his own sister. This honest testimony had angered Pierre Cauchon at the time, who had called Bailly a traitor and refused to pay him. But this initial inquiry, while revealing serious problems with the 1431 trial, did not have the authority to overturn the verdict. That would require action from the Church, specifically from the Pope. The wheels of ecclesiastical justice moved slowly, but they were beginning to turn. In 1452, Guillaume d'Estouteville, Cardinal Bishop of Digne and Papal Legate to France, took up the cause. He was motivated by several factors. His family had been loyal supporters of Charles VII during the English occupation and had suffered for it. He wanted to clear the king's name by removing any association with a convicted heretic. He also wanted to demonstrate loyalty to France and to the Pope by correcting an injustice that had been committed under English pressure. D'Estouteville, acting in his capacity as papal legate, handed the inquiry to Jean Bréhal, the Inquisitor General of France. On May 2, 1452, Bréhal began questioning witnesses. This inquiry was more thorough than the 1450 investigation. More witnesses were called, more details emerged about the irregularities of the original trial, but still no formal retrial was initiated. Political considerations and church bureaucracy delayed further action. Finally, in 1455, Joan's mother, Isabelle Romée, took matters into her own hands. She was elderly now, weakened by age and grief, but determined. On November 7, 1455, Isabelle appeared before a church commission. She was accompanied by her sons Jean and Pierre d'Arc. They petitioned for a formal retrial. Isabelle pleaded for the rehabilitation of her daughter and the restoration of the family's honour. The charge of heresy had stained the entire d'Arc family. By shifting the case to a family petition rather than a royal action, the church could avoid accusations of simply bowing to political pressure from Charles VII. Pope Calixtus III, responding to the petition, authorised a formal retrial. He appointed a papal commission to investigate. The commission included the Inquisitor General Jean Bréhal, the Archbishop of Reims, the Bishop of Paris, and the Bishop of Coutances. These were serious, respected churchmen. The proceedings would be conducted according to proper ecclesiastical law. The rehabilitation trial, also known as the nullification trial, began in earnest in late 1455. A tribunal travelled to various locations gathering testimony. They went to Domrémy, Joan's home village. They questioned people who had known her as a child. Old friends like Joviet and Menguet testified about Joan's piety, her kindness and her devotion. They described a girl who was exceptionally religious, but also cheerful and helpful. The tribunal travelled to Vaucouleurs, where Joan had first convinced Robert de Baudricourt to give her an escort. They travelled to Orleans, where citizens testified about Joan's role in lifting the siege. They travelled to Rouen, where the original trial had taken place. In total, over 115 witnesses gave testimony. These included soldiers who had fought alongside Joan, nobles who had known her, clergy who had observed the original trial, and ordinary people whose lives she had touched. The testimony was overwhelmingly positive. Witnesses spoke of Joan's courage, her piety, her virginity, her devotion to God and to France. Jean d'Aulon, who had been Joan's steward and one of her most devoted followers, gave particularly important testimony about her character and her military campaigns. He had been captured with her at Compiègne and had witnessed her suffering in captivity. Many of the clerics who had participated in the original trial were called to testify. Some admitted that they had been pressured by the English. Some claimed they could not remember details, especially when asked about whether Joan had been tortured or threatened. Some expressed regret. Martin Ladvenu, the Dominican friar who had heard Joan's final confession before her execution, testified movingly about her piety and her insistence that her voices came from God. The tribunal also examined the procedures of the original trial in detail. They found numerous violations of canon law. Joan had been held in a secular prison guarded by men rather than in a church prison guarded by women. She had been denied proper legal counsel. The judges had been partisan, selected specifically because they supported the English cause. Pierre Cauchon had pressured witnesses and manipulated evidence. The trial had been conducted in a jurisdiction where Cauchon technically had no authority, requiring a special grant from the Rouen Cathedral chapter. The charges had been politically motivated rather than genuinely theological. The Rehabilitation Tribunal produced a massive body of documentation. In addition to the witness testimonies, learned theologians and canon lawyers submitted 8 formal opinions analysing the case. These memoranda examined the theological and legal issues in detail. They concluded unanimously that the original trial had been fundamentally flawed and unjust. Jean Brehal, the Inquisitor General, prepared a comprehensive summary of the case in June 1456. This document, known as the Recollectio, laid out the evidence systematically. Brehal concluded that Joan had been a faithful Catholic, that her voices likely came from God or at least were not demonic, that she had died a martyr, and that Pierre Cauchon and those who had convicted her may themselves have been guilty of heresy for condemning an innocent woman out of political hatred. On July 7, 1456, the verdict was announced. The proceedings took place in the Archbishop's Palace in Rouen in the Great Hall, beginning at 9 o'clock in the morning. The judges and commissioners sat at the head of the hall. Jean Brehal, the Archbishop of Reims, the Bishop of Paris, and the Bishop of Coutances. Joan's aged mother Isabel was present, along with her sons Jean and Pierre. The hall was packed with clergy, spectators, and witnesses. Martin Ladvenu was there, the friar who'd comforted Joan in her final moments. Guillaume Manchon, the notary from the original trial, was present. The Archbishop of Reims read the verdict. The court declared that the 1431 trial had been tainted by fraud, deceit, calumny, and manifest errors of law and fact. The verdict of that trial was declared null, invalid, and worthless. Joan was declared innocent of all charges. Her good name and that of her family was restored. A copy of the original accusations against Joan was ritually torn up and ordered to be burned by the public executioner. The verdict stated in full, in consideration of the request of the Dark family against the Bishop of Beauvais, the promoter of criminal proceedings, and the Inquisitor of Rouen, in consideration of the facts we say, pronounce, decree, and declare that the said trial and sentence being tainted with fraud, calumny, iniquity, and contradiction, and manifest errors of fact and of law, to have been and to be null, invalid, worthless, without effect, and annihilated. Isabel Romay, now vindicated after 25 years of grief and shame, wept. Her daughter had been declared innocent. The stain of heresy was removed from the family. Joan's memory was restored. After the verdict was announced in Rouen, the Inquisitor General set off to inform King Charles VII and the Pope. As he passed through Orleans on July 27, 1456, the citizens of the city treated him to a celebratory banquet. Orleans had never forgotten the maid who had saved them. They celebrated her vindication with joy and thanksgiving. The rehabilitation of Joan of Arc was complete, but her story did not end there. Over the following centuries, her legend grew. She became not just a French heroine, but a universal symbol of courage, faith, and resistance against injustice. Her influence extended far beyond her brief 2 years of public life. The nullification of Joan's conviction in 1456 restored her honour and vindicated her memory, but it did not immediately make her a saint in the formal sense. That process would take centuries more. For decades after the rehabilitation trial, Joan remained a local heroine, particularly beloved in Orleans and other places she had liberated. But she was not yet recognised by the Universal Church as a saint. The 100 Years' War ended in 1453, just 3 years before Joan's rehabilitation, when French forces achieved final victory at the Battle of Castillon. The English were expelled from all French territory except Calais, which they would hold until 1558. France emerged from the long conflict unified and strong, a centralised kingdom under a legitimate monarchy. Joan of Arc had been the catalyst for this transformation. Her intervention at Orleans had turned the tide when France seemed on the verge of collapse. Over the centuries, Joan's story was told and retold. Writers, poets, and historians recounted her deeds. She appeared in plays and poems, but for a long time she remained primarily a national symbol rather than a religious one. The Protestant Reformation complicated matters. Some Protestants viewed Joan sceptically because of her claims of direct revelation and her devotion to Catholic saints. Some Catholics were uncertain about how to interpret her visions and her defiance of church authorities, even though she had been vindicated. The French Revolution and the Napoleonic era saw renewed interest in Joan as a national symbol. Napoleon Bonaparte venerated her as an example of French patriotism and military genius. But it was in the 19th century that serious scholarly attention returned to Joan's trials. In the 1840s, Jules Quicherat, a French historian, published a comprehensive 5-volume edition of the trial documents, both from the condemnation trial of 1431 and the rehabilitation trial of 1456. This was the first time these documents had been published in full, making them accessible to scholars. Quicherat's work was meticulous, drawing directly from medieval manuscripts. It revealed the extraordinary detail available about Joan's life and trials. No other medieval figure had left such extensive documentation of their actual words and experiences. Quicherat's publication sparked renewed interest in Joan. Historians could now study the primary sources. The more scholars examined the evidence, the clearer it became that Joan had been a remarkable person, that her trial in 1431 had been a travesty of justice, and that the rehabilitation verdict of 1456 had been correct. The documents showed Joan's intelligence, her courage, her absolute conviction in her divine mission. This scholarly revival coincided with growing devotion to Joan in France and beyond. Churches dedicated to her were built, statues were erected in her honour. Pilgrimages to sites associated with her life became popular. The more people learned about Joan, the more she was venerated not just as a national heroine, but as a model of Christian faith and courage. In 1869, Bishop Félix-Antoine Philibert Dupanloup of Orleans formally petitioned the Vatican to initiate the process for Joan's beatification. This marked the beginning of the formal canonical process. The Congregation of Rites, the Vatican body responsible for examining candidates for sainthood, conducted an extensive investigation. They reviewed the historical evidence, examined the rehabilitation trial documents, and investigated reported miracles attributed to Joan's intercession. The process was thorough and took decades. Theologians examined whether Joan's visions aligned with Orthodox Catholic teaching on revelation. They concluded that her claims of divine guidance were consistent with authentic mystical experiences understood in Catholic theology. Her life showed heroic virtue. Her death showed martyrdom, not in the technical sense of dying for explicitly confessing faith in Christ, but in the sense of dying as a result of faithfulness to what she believed God had commanded her to do. On April 11, 1909, Pope Pius VII approved the decree recognising Joan's heroic virtues, officially declaring her Venerable Joan of Arc. This was the first major step in the canonization process, but the process required documented miracles attributable to her intercession. Over the following years, several such cases were investigated. Medical cures that could not be explained by natural means were examined rigorously. The Vatican required multiple miracles to proceed with beatification and canonization. On April 18, 1909, Pope Pius X beatified Joan of Arc in a solemn ceremony at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Beatification made her Blessed Joan of Arc, recognizing her as worthy of public veneration. Her feast day was established as May 30th, the anniversary of her martyrdom. But she was not yet formally a saint of the Universal Church. One more step remained. That final step came on May 16, 920, when Pope Benedict XV canonized Joan of Arc as a saint of the Catholic Church. The ceremony was conducted with great solemnity at St. Peter's. The Pope issued the Bull Divina Disponente, formally declaring Joan of Arc a saint. Canonization recognized that her life, her mission, her visions, and her death were authentic manifestations of divine grace working through a humble peasant girl. The timing was significant. The canonization came just 2 years after the end of World War I, a conflict in which France had once again faced invasion and near defeat before ultimately prevailing. Joan's example of courage and faith in France's darkest hour resonated powerfully with the French people. She was declared a patroness of France, alongside other national saints. In 1922, Pope Benedict XV extended Joan's patronage specifically to France, reflecting the widespread veneration she received. Her feast day on May 30th became a day of special celebration in France. In June 1920, the French Parliament declared the second Sunday in May a national holiday in Joan's honour. This secular recognition complemented her religious canonization, acknowledging her dual role as both saint and national heroine. Joan's legacy extends far beyond France and far beyond Catholicism. She has become a universal symbol recognized across cultures and religions. She represents courage in the face of impossible odds. She represents faith in one's convictions even unto death. She represents the power of an individual to change history. She represents resistance against oppression and injustice. Her story has been told in countless books, films, plays, and works of art. George Bernard Shaw wrote St. Joan in 1923, a play that examined her life and trial with sympathy and insight. Carl Theodor Dreyer's 1928 silent film The Passion of Joan of Arc is considered one of the greatest films ever made, with actress Renée Falconetti giving an extraordinarily moving performance of Joan's trial and execution. Innumerable other adaptations have followed, from serious historical dramas to popular entertainment. Statues of Joan of Arc stand in cities around the world. In France, she is ubiquitous. Every major French city has a statue or street named for her. In Orléans, the city she saved, an entire festival is held every year in her honour, with parades, ceremonies, and celebrations. The house traditionally identified as her family home in Domrémy has been preserved as a museum. The church where she was baptised still stands. The cathedral at Reims, where she stood beside Charles VII at his coronation, draws pilgrims who come to remember her role in French history. But Joan's appeal transcends nationalism. She speaks to anyone who has faced doubt, fear, and overwhelming opposition. She represents the possibility that one person, even someone young and powerless by worldly standards, can make a difference. Her story shows that courage and faith can overcome apparently insurmountable obstacles. Military historians recognize Joan as a genuinely innovative commander who understood the importance of morale and aggressive tactics. Her insistence on attacking rather than waiting defensively, her presence at the front, inspiring troops, her use of artillery, and her ability to coordinate combined arms operations were all ahead of her time. While she did not personally devise complex strategies, she grasped tactical and operational realities that many experienced commanders of her era did not. Theologians and scholars of mysticism study Joan's visions and voices as examples of authentic religious experience. Her absolute conviction, her humility in attributing all success to God, her maintenance of her faith even unto death, all mark her as a genuine mystic in the Christian tradition. The Church's eventual recognition of her sanctity validated the claim that her experiences, however unusual and controversial at the time, were authentic workings of divine grace. Feminists and advocates for women's rights see in Joan an early example of a woman breaking through barriers of gender. In a world where women had almost no public role, where they were expected to be silent and submissive, Joan commanded armies, counselled kings, and changed the course of history. He did so while maintaining her chastity and her feminine identity, but she refused to be limited by the restrictions her society placed on women. She wore men's clothing when necessary for practical reasons. She argued with male military commanders and often proved right. She stood before learned male theologians and held her own in theological debate despite having no formal education. Joan showed that women could be as courageous, as intelligent, and as capable as men. Legal scholars and human rights advocates point to Joan's trial as an early example of judicial injustice and the importance of proper legal procedure. The trial of 1431 violated numerous principles of justice. The judges were partisan, the accused had no counsel, evidence was manipulated, intimidation and coercion were used. The rehabilitation trial of 1456, by contrast, followed proper procedures, gathered extensive testimony, and reached a just verdict. Joan's case demonstrates the importance of fair trials and the possibility of correcting injustice even long after the fact. Joan of Arc lived for only 19 years. Her public career lasted just 2 years, from early 1429 when she arrived at Chinon until her capture in May 1430. In that brief time, she changed the world. She saved France from conquest, restored a king to his throne, revived a nation's hope, and became a symbol that has inspired millions across the centuries. She was born a peasant in an obscure village on the frontier of a kingdom torn by war. She should have lived and died in anonymity, perhaps married to a local farmer, raising children, working the land. Instead, compelled by voices she believed came from God, she left her village, convinced a prince, led armies, won battles, attended a coronation, endured captivity, faced an unjust trial, and died in flames at the age of 19, calling on Jesus with her last breath. Her story is extraordinary, seemingly impossible, yet it is true. The documentation is extensive. The trial records with Joan's own words survive. The testimonies of those who knew her survive. The historical events are undisputed. Joan of Arc was real. Her accomplishments were real. Her courage was real. Her faith was real. Nearly 600 years after her death, Joan of Arc remains one of the most remarkable figures in human history. She is remembered and honoured not just in France but around the world. She is a saint of the Catholic Church, a national heroine of France, and a universal symbol of courage, faith, and the triumph of the human spirit against impossible odds. From a garden in Domrémy where a young girl first heard voices, to the flames of Rouen where she died, to the halls of the Vatican, where she was proclaimed a saint, to the countless places where her story inspires people today, Joan of Arc's legacy endures. She proved that one person, armed with courage and faith, can change the course of history. And that lesson, more than any specific historical outcome, is perhaps the greatest legacy of the Maid of Orleans.